So hello everyone, very welcome to our talk given by Dimitris Vadoulakis, Professor Dimitris Vadoulakis tonight. And it will be a talk given in English, but you can activate the subtitle, spontaneous subtitle for Chinese audience. I think somewhere in the Zoom function, you can find it, you will easily find it. So you will have the subtitle in English. And you can follow us on Bilibili, the official accounts of Fudan University. So first of all, just let me briefly introduce Professor Dimitris Vadoulakis. As you might have seen in our post, Professor Dimitris Vadoulakis was the inaugural chair of philosophy at Western Sydney University. Some of his books are Sovereignty and its other, published in 2013, Stasis Before the State, Narcissus on Agonistic Democracy, Spinoza, the Epicurean Authority and Utility in Materialism, and the Rules of Technique, Heidegger's Magical Materialism, forthcoming next year. And he's the director of Thinking Out Loud, the Sydney Lectures in Philosophy and Society, and the co-editor of the book Theories Incitement from Edinburgh University Press. And he is currently serving as the chair of Australasian Society for Continental Philosophy. So he will today give us a talk on the ancient origins of materialism. I think the key point here is to show that there's a very profound similarity between what we call traditionally historical materialism and ancient materialism, especially Epicurean version of materialism. That's how I understand it. Yeah, maybe there are more points to develop later during the talk. And today we also have one of my colleagues at Fudan University, Dr. Wang Wei. Wang Wei is assistant professor at the philosophy department, and he's graduated from Princeton University on classics, right? On classics. And he's been doing research since a long time on ancient philosophy, especially on Aristotelian theoretical philosophy and the history of metaphysics and history of ancient science. So after Professor Vadoulakis' talk, Wang Wei will share some of his ideas and comments on Dimitris' speech. So let's please join me to welcome warmly Professor Dimitris Vadoulakis to his talk. Please, Dimitris.
So first, let me thank the philosophy department at Fudan University, the philosophy department as a whole, for hosting this talk. It's great to give another talk at Fudan, and I hope next time I'll be able to be back in Shanghai and do it in person, but also to thank the department for hosting me in the pages of the journal, the yearly report on studies of Marxism abroad. But I also like to thank Professor Chunming Wang for organizing the talk, and Assistant Professor Wei Wang, who offered to do the response very bravely, even though he had no final text of the talk. I mean, there is no final text of the talk. I hope that Professor Wei Wang has read Pierre Bayard's book, How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read, which was indeed very handy for me once when I was asked to do a response to a book manuscript that the author only sent me a few hours before the event. So, hopefully Professor Wei Wang has read that book and he'll be able to do a good job. But seriously, what's really in the background here is I have to confess that this presentation is a combination of ideas that I have developed over 3 monographs. The first one has been published already. It's called Spinoza, the Epicurean Authority and Utility in Materialism. The second one is The Rules of Technique, Heidegger's Magical Materialism, which is coming out hopefully next year. And the third one is The Logic of Living, Monism and Materialism in Ancient Thought, which I'm finishing currently, and it should be out in 2024. And the common theme, the common denominator in all of these books is the notion of materialism, which I examine in 3 sort of crucial periods: antiquity, early modernity, and from the 20th century onward. So the talk I'm doing today is a kind of combination of all these different sort of strands that I have written about and I've been writing about in relation to materialism. So my talk tonight has 5 parts. I'll start with outlining the problematic status of Marxist dissertation, as I said, and this will lead to a discussion of monism and Marxism in antiquity, and especially what I call, and I'll try to define it, the problematic of action in monism. Third, I will present the classical solution, the ancient solution to this problematic of action that I will have already outlined. After that, fourth, I'll show how the ancient solution implies an agonistic politics that allies with a critical Marxist notion in his social and political philosophy, namely the idea of the class struggle. And finally, I will conclude with a few remarks about the connection between ontology and praxis. So let me start with number 1. The title of the first section is The Problem Posed by Marxist Dissertation. There are broadly speaking, 2 strategies of dealing with Marxist dissertation, which was on Democritus and Epicurus's atomism. It was titled Über die Differenz der demokratischen und epikureischen Naturphilosophie, which was finished in 1841, so very early work. So the 2 strategies: either the dissertation is ignored and it's castigated, it's like pushed aside because it's juvenalia that was published or written before the epistemic break in Marxist thought, that is before his scientific writings. And according to this approach, the dissertation has little relevance. Or the other approach is to treat it as an investigation in the ancient sources of materialism, whereby it doesn't really have relevance as such to political economy, but it's a historical kind of investigation. We can see Louis Althusser as kind of exemplifying both of these approaches, and I'm not saying that Althusser directly addresses the dissertation explicitly in a systematic way, but Althusser exemplifies both these approaches, both because he both puts forward the idea of the epistemological break in Marx, but also he puts forward the idea of an underground current of materialism. And he refers, when he goes to describe this idea of the underground current of materialism, he refers explicitly to Epicureanism. He starts his famous essay with that image of the raindrops, and he outside his window, and he compares the raindrops to the falling atoms in the void, according to Epicureanism. So the difficulty here is not so much that one cannot have it both ways, like you cannot have, like Althusser, both an epistemic break and a kind of historical account of the significance of the dissertation. Rather, the difficulty is how to rescue a conception of praxis that is a theory that explains how human beings are historical actors within the purview of a materialist ontology. Like, how can you have both an ontology and a theory of praxis? How you can combine, to put it in broader terms, theory and praxis? If the former alternative of the epistemological break is chosen, then the historical background is no longer needed, and it is, simply the economy that matters, the political economic writings that matter. If the latter alternative is chosen, the sort of route of saying, well, we've got a history of materialism, which is an underground current, and we need to investigate that history by going back to atomism itself, which was kind of Althusser's argument, then the only route, the only kind of possibility to lead back to praxis is the one that Althusser takes when he talks about the aleatory, the contingent, the accidental, and so on and so forth, or which becomes eventually that whole discourse of the event, that something that happens completely unpredictably, without any planning, something which is like a revolutionary event that is completely unexpected, and so on and so forth. But it is clear in this instance that that notion of the event is absent in Marx. His notion of revolution has nothing to do with the revolution the way we find it in these thinkers of the event. So, I was thinking about the dissertation. I was stuck between these two options. And then a year or two ago, I read a truly magnificent piece of work by Charles Barbour. He shared with me some chapters of a book that he's writing on the early writings of Marx, and which frankly blew me away. And Charles Barbour essentially argues that the dissertation is partly about ancient materialism, but is also partly a conversation that Marx is conducting with contemporary philosophers. And, the position, say, of Epicurus is occupied really by other contemporary philosophers. That conversation is hidden behind the presentation of atomism, and which is all about the ontology is all about political and social issues, and is all about praxis, is all about action. So if Barbour's thesis is correct, and I believe it is because it's astonishingly erudite and compelling, the position of this dissertation has suddenly changed. It is no longer a matter of trying to weed out the metaphysical writings from the scientific ones, nor does it make sense to separate the historical part of the argument from the analysis of the debates about contemporary philosophical issues. Rather, the Marx of the early 40s is deeply politically engaged, both in works like his journalistic writings of the period and in his ontological kind of musings and ontological kind of positioning in the dissertation. And this leads us, if we agree with Barbour and this kind of conclusion, this leads us back to the original point. How are we to evaluate the conception of praxis in the dissertation? Or more starkly put, what does ancient atomism have to do with the class struggle? Is there a complete separation here? Can we find any connection? Here I will attempt to provide a firm framework for this answer. This framework is not an exegesis of Marx. I'm not claiming that this is what Marx was thinking or what he was suggesting when he was writing the dissertation. Rather, I'm claiming that this is a framework that was available to him and which is consistent with the development of his thought. And more importantly, even if Marx was not conscious of that framework, and how can we be sure of authorial intentions? Who knows what Marx was thinking? Still, the framework is operative. It operates still in his thought, even if he was not conscious of it. And now the second part, two ontological possibilities and the theory of praxis. When I started doing research on materialism several years ago now, I was struck by the lack of any comprehensive account of the history of materialism, the historical materialism naturally, but materialism broadly speaking, any lack of any historical account of materialism from antiquity to the present. And note, of course, that if such an account existed, Marx's dissertation would have been much, the problems about Marx's dissertation that are outlined above would have been much easier to answer with reference to such an account, because then we would have known, what does an ontology of materialism such as atomism have to do with praxis and how are the two connected. In fact, the only seriously ambitious and comprehensive book on the topic of the history of materialism that I found is Friedrich Lange's book Geschichte des Materialismus und Kritik seiner Bedeutung in der Gegenwart, which was first published in 1866 and is basically, nobody knows it today. Maybe people know it in China, I'm not sure, but in the English and European speaking world, only Nietzsche scholars know Lange's work, because he was a major influence on Nietzsche in the 1860s. But also, it's worth remembering that Friedrich Lange was a major neo-Kantian, and his book was, very widely read at that point in the 19th century. Anyway, Lange provides a very simple, very straightforward definition of materialism. Materialism is, according to Lange, the ontological position that rejects transcendence. This allows him to follow the thread of this idea from the Ionian cosmologists at the beginning of philosophy to Kantian idealism, whose ontology he regards as adhering closely to his definition as materialist. In other words, he regards Kant as the greatest materialist there was, because in his interpretation, transcendental idealism has no transcendence. And I hold that Lange, Friedrich Lange, is partly correct in his definition of materialism, but he leaves out one significant element, namely, what is the conception of praxis for such an ontological materialism? What does it mean? Can we have a consistent conception of praxis when we say we reject transcendence? Or, we can have all sorts of different conceptions of praxis, in which case there is no such a thing as a materialist conception of praxis, which is the problem I identified also in the dissertation. So to tackle this, we can shift registers a little bit. What does it mean to reject transcendence? It means that one has to assume that the entirety of existence, everything that exists, is of the same ontological quality. There are no beings that are qualitatively different. To put it in naturalistic terms, there is nothing that is exempt from the laws of nature. Everything is subject to the laws of nature. What does it mean to accept transcendence? On the other hand, the opposite position. It means that you accept that there are existing things that are of a different quality. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the only being that is qualitatively distinct is God. Further, God has the capacity to create things out of nothing and to perform miracles, both of which are instances of breaking the laws of nature. We can call the former position, the position that rejects transcendence and thinks that there is no qualities outside, there's no existence that have different qualities. We can call that position monism. There is only one. Monos means one. Okay, there is only one quality of existence. And the other position that has transcendence, we can call that creationism, because it posits the possibility that something can be created out of nothing. There is creation ex nihilo, as the theologians put it. If this distinction is correct between monism and creationism, you can immediately see why a thinker like Spinoza was regarded as a blasphemous atheist, even though he talked about God all the time. Nonetheless, even though he talked about God all the time, his definition of God as a totality outside of which nothing exists was decidedly anti-creationist. It was decidedly materialist. Spinoza was a monist materialist. In fact, I'd hold that for anti-creationism to be tenable, for materialism to be tenable, monism and materialism need to coexist. I'll probably talk a little bit more on that later. If we define materialism as relying on a monist ontology, everything that is of one quality, there is no hard to say that ancient philosophy is decidedly monist. The Greeks never thought that there was any existent that had an ontologically different quality. Even their gods behaved like humans, not because the Greeks were anthropomorphizing, but for the complete opposite reason, namely, because even the gods were not transcendent. And there is an amazing book by Detienne and Cisse called The Lives of the Greek Gods that makes this point in a compelling way. It is this shared ontological conception, the monism, that I refer to as ancient monism of the Greek thought. Now, monism received different philosophical articulations in antiquity. For example, Democritus expressed it by saying that nothing can come out of nothing. Epicurus expressed it, the same point, by saying that all that is forms a totality outside of which nothing exists. And the Stoics conceived of an all-inclusive nature that comes from fire, according to Zeno, that is either active or passive, but which nonetheless can admit nothing outside of it. Now, we can immediately see, when we've defined monism and materialism in this way, we can immediately see that a monist materialist faces a very big difficulty, significant difficulty in how to account not for action itself, but for difference in action. How can we say, if there is only one ontological quality, how can we say that our actions differ from each other? Why are they different from each other? And this is the part of the problem. I mentioned earlier that Lange's answer is partial, is defective, it's not complete. This is the part of the problem that Lange does not touch upon. So if there is nothing outside being, then how can we account for different actions? If all is one, why does it matter what we do? If everything is one, aren't contradictory courses of actions ultimately the same? The result of this, this is what I call the problematic of action in monism. The result here is a hesitation to act, even avoiding acting altogether, or even worse, acting unconcerned about the good, acting capriciously and immorally, or being a sociopath, as psychoanalysts would say. And this is not a problematic that is absent from our thoughts. I mean, often we say, well, why do I bother going to vote for a different party in elections? We say in liberal democracy, many people wonder in a liberal democracy, why bother voting for a different party if all are the same? If everything is the same, ultimately, what's the point of acting at all? Then we see the same problem in existentialism. In Camus' The Stranger, like, does it make a difference to kill an Arab on the beach or not? That's the question. It's the same question, and so on. But we can find other sort of contemporary examples. But I just want to mention one important example here, and that is that this problematic of action was in fact the main point of attack against Spinoza in the first major phase of the reception of his work. And that's important historically, because it seems to me that people in the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century, were acutely aware of this problematic of action in monism. And I'm referring here to Bayle's dictionary and his famous entry on Spinoza. As you probably know, Spinoza's works were banned immediately after their publication. And for about 150 years, the only thing that people read about Spinoza, the only way that they knew Spinoza, was through Bayle's very long dictionary entry on Spinoza in his dictionary. And so that's a very, very important document for the study and the reception of Spinoza for the first 150 years after the publication of his works. And in this document, in this entry in his dictionary, Bayle returns over and over to the problematic of action, monism. Just to mention my favorite example, he has numerous examples about how Spinoza's monism cannot allow for praxis. But my favorite example is at one point Bayle says, well, if Spinoza is correct, and if indeed God is an entity outside of which nothing exists, we're all parts of God. God is not of a different ontological quality. Then we're completely wrong. If that is correct, we're completely wrong to say that if there is a battle and the Germans killed 10,000 Turks, we're completely wrong to say that. We should actually be saying that there was a battle and God personified into Germans killed God personified into 10,000 Turks, right? So that's the paradox, that's the difficulty of accounting for difference in action in monism. In a sense, the problem faced by monism is the same problem that the modern interpreter faces in reading Marx's dissertation. How can we move from a materialist ontology, which is to say from monism, there's no transcendence, onto a theory of praxis that is consistent with that ontology, and that allows us to give us an account of action that is not trivial, not everything is the same. This is the question, as Marx might have put it, hic Rhodus. Let me go to the third section now, which is to give you a description of how ancient writers respond to the problematic of action. What is the answer that they give to that problematic of action, ancient authors? And I'll turn here to Cicero's book De Finibus, because it is the most famous summary of the main different ancient theories of action, of ethics and politics. So it's handy to refer to Cicero. So the setting is 79 BC in Athens. And it's 5 friends, 5 Romans, who've just been to a lecture by Antiochus, who is like the most famous Platonist of his time. That lecture was inside the walls of Athens, in the new setting of the Platonic school. And after the talk that they've listened to, they wander outside the walls of Athens. They go to the old site of the original site where Plato had established his academy about 3 centuries, about 300 years, 3 centuries earlier. And they're doing some sightseeing. There was the time when it was possible to have philosophy as a tourist attraction. It doesn't really happen anymore. In fact, they're very pleased with themselves because they arrive to the side of the old academy late in the afternoon, and no other people are around. So the Uber tourist is always a tourist that hates other tourists. So they're very pleased with themselves. We've avoided the hordes of tourists who have been here to visit the original site of the academy, which was the first ever formal school of philosophy, the school where the first philosophical lectures were ever delivered. At that point, as they're hanging around there, they basically decide to do a little bit of philosophy themselves, and they ask, what is the most important philosophical question? And we're lucky enough to know what they regard as the most important philosophical question, a philosophical question that they say would have been discussed and debated and taught at the very place where they're standing by famous philosophers. And we know the answer because one of the friends was Cicero, and he recorded that conversation in book 5 of De Finibus Bonorum and Malorum, which we can translate roughly as on ends of good and evil acts, or good and evil effects, or something like that. I'll return to the title. So this is a kind of crucial juncture, they're returning to the side of the first philosophical school. They're talking about the most significant question, and that's what they say. I can put this on a shared screen if you want. I'm not sure where it's gone. Hold on a second. Oh, there it is. So this is a quotation. So this is how they introduce the most significant question in philosophy. They call it the most significant question in philosophy. Or rather, the question in philosophy that if it's settled, every other question will be settled. Our friend Lucius, then, is prudent. We want principally to learn about the supreme good when this question is settled in philosophy. So is every other question. on other issues, and incomplete on a certain grasp is harmful in proportion to the value of the topic where the neglect occurs. Ignorance of the supreme good, however, is necessarily equivalent to ignorance of the logic of living. Once we know what the ultimate good is and evils are, then we have a path through life, a model of all our duties, to which each of our actions can thereby be referred. From this, we'll be able happily to identify and compare the logic of living that we all aim at. But there is great disagreement about what this would be. I underscore here, once, however, we have settled the question of the ends, once we know the ultimate good and evil. So the primary question is about the good, but this question really concerns the question of the ends of action. So all the friends agree that there is one question that settles every other philosophical question. That's the question of the good, and everyone agrees that to settle the question of the good, you have to ask the question about the ends of action. I should mention here very quickly that this whole discourse about the ends of action is not peculiar here to Cicero. It's rather a discourse that was very prevalent in antiquity, and there were various books called on ends, including one by Epicurus himself, but unfortunately only a few little fragments have survived here and there. So I just want to mention that as a kind of aside. The question of the ends is the primary philosophical question because it provides the answer to the problematic of action in monism that I outlined earlier. And which I argue was very important for providing an answer to how actions are different in monist materialism. And the answer that the ancients give to the problematic of action is deceptively simple. If we cannot differentiate actions because they have different qualities, because if we give them different qualities, it means that things of different qualities exist and we're no longer monists. If we cannot do that, all we have to do really is to differentiate between the ends of action and the effects of actions. Okay? And this is an answer that we find consistently across the ancient authors, even though what the ends or the effects of action are themselves, there's great disagreement about that. But it's through the ends of action, as opposed to a qualitative difference between the actions themselves, that they try to assign a difference to action. This is a materialist answer to the problem of action, to the extent that it's concerned with the effects of action. It is about the material manifestation of praxis. It is also monist in the sense that it denies that action is governed by something external to it, such as values. We have certain values that tell us what good and bad is. It is, to put it in Nietzschean terms, beyond good and evil. If these two are regarded as values that dictate action. Thus, it forecloses not only the possibility of Christian moral theory, this answer about that says, we can differentiate actions not because they're good and evil, but because of the different effects that they produce. But it also, such an answer forecloses all possibility for a kind of theory of moral action that is what we'll call today deontological, kind of Kantian or Kantian-inspired position about ethics. Let me give you one example. I'm happy to provide lots of examples of this position about how to differentiate action within a monist materialist framework. Let me give you one example because it's a rather well-known example, especially for people working in Cornell philosophy. And that's an example from Plato's Sophist. The as you remember, this is one of the so-called Eleatic dialogues, namely dialogues about Parmenides, and Parmenides was the most famous monist in antiquity. And this is in some of the Eleatic dialogues, of course, the key character is not Socrates himself. Socrates does not participate in the main dialogue, but is the Eleatic stranger who is the main participant in the dialogue. And the topic that they said in the Sophist is how to define who the Sophist is. Okay, and they reach a kind of point where they reach a paradox, as they call it. And the paradox is the following: the Sophist says things that do not exist, so his actions point to something that does not exist. And then the Eleatic stranger says, but well, if that is true, it means that we have posited a quality of existence that is different from the things that exist, and we can encounter non-material reality. So therefore, the definition of the Sophist cannot be true. And it is at that point of the dialogue where the famous phrase, he says the famous thing, that the question of being has never been adequately considered, which is the phrase that Martin Heidegger uses in Being and Time as the epigraph to Being and Time, right? And what is the Eleatic stranger's approach to answer the question of what is the Sophist? Well, he does an absolutely incredible series of distinctions. It performs an incredible series of distinctions that is almost comical about different actions. He talks about the hunter, the fisherman, and so on and so forth, about the effects that different actions have. So he approaches the question of the Sophist purely through the effects of the Sophist actions in order to define the Sophist. So, I think it's, let me give you, maybe one more example. Okay, in Cicero himself, in book 5, immediately after the quotation that I offered, the friends go on to discuss a very famous typology of ends of action or effects of action from Carneades, who was another famous Platonic philosopher from one generation before. Oh, maybe I give you a third example, just to say, because it goes, now we'll go to the 4th century AD. In St. Augustine, in book 19 of The City of God. This is a book where he wants to attack ancient philosophers. And how does he attack ancient philosophers? Not the theory of forms, not any of these things, but he attacks ancient philosophers by identifying what he identifies 288 positions of pagan philosophers, as he calls them, about the conception of the end of action, of the final end. Okay. So we see then from all the way from Plato to Augustine, with Cicero in between, this kind of obsession with the ends of action. Why? Because that gives us an answer to the problem of monism in materialism. So that was the third section, to sort of give you the answer that we find in antiquity. Now, number 4, from the two ends of action to class struggle. Here, I'd like to sort of nuance a little bit some implications of understanding action in terms of its ends. What does that mean? Okay, like I sort of gave you the framework, but what does that mean? Okay. Aristotle's unique contribution to this whole debate about the ends of action within a monist materialist framework consists in providing the fundamental distinction between two different kinds of ends. And the next quotation I have, let me put it up on your screen, is from the very opening of Nicomachean Ethics. This is the this is how Nicomachean ethics opens, right? Every skill and every inquiry, and similarly every action and rational choice is thought to aim at some good. Exactly the same point that Cicero made. Yeah? Every philosophical thought aims towards the good. And so the good has been aptly described as that at which everything aims. But it is clear, and that is the original point that he's making, but it is clear there is a distinction between two kinds of ends. Some ends are activities, energia, while others are products, erga, which are additional to the activities. In cases where there are ends additional to the actions, the products are by their nature better than the activities. Since there are many actions, skills, and sciences, it happens that there are many ends as well. Let me give you an example here to highlight the distinction between erga and energia and the two different ends that they have. Yeah? Now, for the end of erga in Aristotle, his standard example is the example of techne, the example of making something. Like, imagine that you make, I don't know, a cup, or you make a bottle to hold water. You know, you make a cup or a bottle or something like that. Okay, so there is a process that makes that cup or water, and that process can be analyzed in terms of four causes. Okay, these four causes apply equally to nature and to techne, to erga. These are the famous four causes: the material cause, what the cup is made of, say clay. Who is making the cup? The potter. The form, the formal cause, how the cup is made, and the final cause, what the cup is made for, namely to hold water, to hold tea or coffee or whatever. So the end of erga is a product, and that end is independent of the process of making. You know, I'm drinking a cup of tea and I'm holding the cup. I don't even know who made it. The cup is well made and its end is fulfilled if I cannot even see that process of making, if it operates independently of the process. Now, the end of energia is completely different. Here, the idea is that an energia is something that we do where the end is commensurate with its enactment. So, for instance, imagine that you're a potter and you're running a workshop, and your end is to make a profit. Okay, you make that profit, and you run your workshop in such a way as to be profitable. The workshop is profitable, okay, by making certain decisions about how many hours to work, what material to use, what material to order that is cheaper or more expensive, and so on and so forth. So the process of your actions is commensurate with attaining your end. Now, later in book 6, he will return to this distinction, and he will say, well, the kind of activity that has the ends that are external to it, he calls it techne, skill, art, whatever you want to call it. The kind of activity that its end is commensurate with its enactment, that its end comes about in the process of it being acted out, he calls phronesis. Okay. And it is phronesis then that Cicero was concerned with when he was talking about the ends of action as being the most important part of philosophy, and the kind of most important thing that most important question of philosophy, that when it's settled, every other question will also be settled, because it is in phronesis that we find sort of analysis of the kind of ends that gives an answer to monist materialism. I'm aware that I'm kind of already 45 minutes in, so I might speed up a little bit if that's okay. One fundamental kind of thing that follows from what I've said, and that's actually incredibly significant in terms of what's going to come later on in the history of thought, is that the end of techne, the end of erga, is something that is measurable, right? The end of production is something that is measurable. I can tell for sure that the cup is well made if it holds tea. If it doesn't hold tea, it's not well made. It hasn't reached its final end. By contrast, the end of phronesis in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is very clear on that. The end of phronesis is something that pertains to the whole of living, to the whole of one's life. Yeah, if you run a workshop, this takes some training to be able to become a technitis, a craftsman that can make the things that are made in the workshop. It takes some training to be able to run a business. And also it takes kind of planning to be able to sort of think about what you want to do in the next few years, and so on and so forth. Okay, so to make a single cup, you make it, the end is reached, it's outside of your control, is measurable. But to do the kind of activity that is referred to as phronesis is something that concerns the whole of one's life, the whole of one's living. So when the Greeks and the Romans talk about ethics, they're not talking about the end of action insofar as action is techne, insofar as action is production. They talk about the end of action insofar as it is phronesis. If we hold this point in our mind, we'll say that when the Greeks and the Romans say that the most fundamental philosophy is about, the most fundamental question of philosophy is about the ends of action, it is de finibus, as Cicero puts it. This is completely different conception from what we call consequentialism or utilitarianism nowadays. So utilitarianism, say, for instance, in Bentham, classical utilitarianism, always will say, well, you can calculate the good or bad effects of individual actions. Okay, that's what the philosophic calculus is in Bentham. Okay, or when John Stuart Mill says, he goes to define freedom in utilitarian terms. He says, well, you can define the limits of freedom by identifying what actions you can do that do not harm others. Okay? So the limits of freedom from here are defined by individual acts. Okay. Now, if you have drawn the distinction between techne on the one hand and phronesis on the other, erga and energia, then it is no longer available to you to talk about individual acts. Phronesis is about acting as a whole. It's about your whole life, your whole way of living, and that includes others. So your decisions of phronesis are not only about you, but also about the community and everybody that is affected by your decisions. And this leads. So as soon as we understand this difference, how the conception of ends in antiquity is so very different from consequentialism and utilitarianism, this leads to the critical point that I was kind of leading all this way, that such a conception of phronesis is necessarily agonistic. Because what does it mean to have a conception to have a calculation about the ends of our life as a whole. You can never make such a calculation with any certainty. That calculation is always subject to debate, is always subject to being proven wrong. You know, you might have a conception about what the end of your action is going to be, but you might reach it and then realize, oh my God, you know, I can't believe I did that, you know, because, you know, circumstances might prove you wrong. In particular, if the ends concern living as a whole, then it's impossible to know with certainty, you know, whether these ends are true or false, and hence there will be disputes about these ends. Also, second, if the ends arise as a response to the given circumstances, which is why, you know, this is a materialist kind of discourse about action, then the circumstances change, and no end can be absolute. Now, this very point becomes the basis in the Epicurus in the principal doctrines, you know, in that sort of very famous discourse from Doctrine 31 to Doctrine 38, that we notice, of course, Marx kind of copying some of these particular notes in his notebooks, even though he doesn't provide any commentary. This is the notes where, you know, the social contract is mentioned and so on and so forth. But we'll find this very limitation of, you know, advantage as well of the notion of phronesis, of the notion of the end that is commensurate with an action. Let me read you just a couple of examples of that. Just put it. This is 36 and 37. In general outline, justice is the same for everyone. For something useful for something useful in mutual association. So justice is nothing external to the circumstances. Justice is something useful, the effects of our actions that are good in the way that we relate to each other. And this is actually not very dissimilar from what Aristotle says in Book 5 of the Discourse of Justice and the Nicomachean Ethics. But with respect to the peculiarities of region or of other relevant causes, it does not follow that the same thing is just for everyone. So would not know the end of our actions for sure, because the circumstances change, the ends change. Of actions believed to be just, that whose usefulness in circumstances of mutual association is supported by the testimony of experience has the attribute of serving as just, whether it's the same for everyone or not. If we have experience that something is just, well, whether you disagree or not, doesn't matter. And if someone passes a law and does not turn out to be in accord with what is useful in mutual associations, in other words, what has positive effects for everyone involved, this no longer possesses the nature of justice. And if what is useful in the sense of being just changes, but for a while fits our basic grasp of justice, nevertheless, it was just only for that length of time, at least for those who do not disturb themselves with empty words, but simply look at facts. Namely, what is just changes when the circumstances change, and what is just changes when what used to be just no longer fits what is useful for us. When if just signifies the kind of action that is beneficial for everybody, that the ends of that action are good for everybody, then the ends of our action are no longer good and no longer just when the circumstances change. Now,
so this is Stoics, or so this is Diogenes Laertius talking about.
Yes, that's Diogenes Laertius is book 10. This is Epicurus, from the Principal Doctrines. Sorry, I thought I mentioned that. This is Epicurus, Principal Doctrines, Diogenes Laertius, book 10, and this is Doctrine 36 and 37. So if we pause and think about what is said here, we'll find here basically the universal justification for evolution. We stop in making calculation about the given circumstances, and we come to the conclusion that what is regarded by us, for instance, the proletariat or whatever group, is in fact not just at all. And even if it was just some time ago, now the circumstances have changed. It is because it's no longer useful to us. It's the effects of whatever is defined as just is no longer useful to us, that we can try to change it. And this is what I call the justification of an agonistic type of politics, of a politics that includes within its definition, includes within its conception, conflict. Now, this argument about ends and changed is revived in modernity. I trace this revival of this argument in Spinoza, and briefly, Spinoza the Epicurean, my book, and briefly this argument about the ends and change and evolution, briefly the argument I make in Spinoza the Epicurean, without going to the details now because I'm really rapidly running out of time, is the following, that basically the idea of phronesis that is described here, the idea of phronesis as the kind of end that is commensurate with this enactment and which leads to this kind of agonistic conception of action. This is translated in early modernity into the discourse of utility and the calculation of utility, not only Spinoza, but in other authors as well. And then this finds its way in the English language and is translated again into the discourse of interest, both in the English economists and significantly also in Scottish philosophy like Adam Smith. And then it finds its way back to Germany, in Marx in particular, through his readings of the English economists and Scottish philosophy. And I'd say we can say in this trajectory that there is this kind of affinity here with the notion of the class struggle. And let me leave that kind of hanging there and go into a few concluding remarks about ontology and praxis, maybe another 3 or 4 minutes. I'll try to be quick here. I'm not going to get off the page again and get distracted. I started by saying that Marx's early metaphysical writings do not seem to make sense of praxis. We see here a neat connection. A monist materialist ontology leads to a praxis that accounts for difference according to the ends of actions. And this is translated into the discourse of interest later on in various discourses, including in Marx. This also makes sense of a claim in the Communist Manifesto that may appear grandiose, if not outright outrageous, that the entire history of humanity can be reduced to the competing interests of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. If by interest we understand intentional acts and the like, then of course this makes no sense. If we're talking about interest in terms of intentional acts, either in a deontological or in a consequentialist framework, this doesn't make sense. But as I said earlier, the distinctive feature of the end of phronesis is that it's about living on life as a whole, not of the individual, but the individual and the individual's community. It is not about individual acts. Within this living as a whole, about the ends of our living. It is within this living as a whole, it is about the ends of our living. From this perspective, the historical claim that Marx and Engels make appears less outrageous, but that requires that we assume that we're working on the basis of a conception of ethical action or of praxis within the purview of the ancient monist materialist framework. Why have this ancient monist materialist framework that is a framework that understands action in terms of their ends? Difference matters because there's different ends. The end, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are different, not because there's anything kind of essentially different between them, but because they have different ends, which is, exactly the point, say, that we find in Plato Plato's sophist, and so on and so forth. You know, the standard kind of answer about the difference in action in ancient monist materialism. Why has this ancient monist materialist framework been lost? Well, we're not talking about it today. I've written a book on this that will appear next year, The Roots of Techne, Heidegger's Magical Materialism. And my answer to it goes something like that very quickly. This has to do with the critique of modernity that basically says that science promised to be neutral and bring progress and good. But the ends of scientific process were meant to be only the application of the laws of nature. However, interests always intervene. That's the moment of the genesis of what the Frankfurt School calls instrumental reason, or what Heidegger calls Machenschaft, or the nihilism of modernity. Namely, the moment the interests intervene in the natural kind of process of applying the laws of nature, then violence arises, then totalitarian politics comes into the frame. What this critique does, the critique of modernity, is twofold. First, it assumes a secular position whereby there is no transcendence. It is a materialist position, as I said before. But unlike the ancients, the ancient monists, and unlike someone like Spinoza, or Marx for that matter, the critique of modernity fails to distinguish between the two ends of action. The final end of production are confused with the instrumental ends of phronesis, and the two become indistinguishable. My whole book on Heidegger is about how this takes place in Heidegger and other authors in modernity. And what is the upshot about all that? The ingrained, was the upshot of confusing the two ends of action and forgetting the discourse about the ends of action in monist materialism, the ingrained pessimism of modernity. Nothing really matters. Everything is really indifferent. The solution to the problem of action in monist materialism avoids such a pessimism. By contrast to the existential dread or the emptiness of the modern subject, a consideration of the ends of action within the purview of monist materialism can provide us a robust historical analysis that, as Marx and Engels show in the Communist Manifesto, can become the ground of action, not in terms of solving our problems, but in terms of identifying shared ends that we can collectively pursue. And as mere human beings in the world, without any transcendent guarantees, that is good enough. Thank you.